is with great delight, coming from this time from North Carolina. Great delight to introduce and let hear tell Milbre Burch.
Thank you so much. Sheila and Donna and the rest of the community, we are blessed that you created this wonderful group. And I can't think of a better place to be on the last day of the year. This is a New Year's Eve story, and it's a Breton folktale. I tell it now in tribute to Natalie Philippot-Bruneau, who came to our household 28 years ago to help us care for our first child, Kate Blake. She was the oldest of 25 cousins and knew far more about babies than either my husband or I, because we were the youngest child in our family. So for Natalie, this story, The Stones of Plouhinec. Plouhinec is a small village on the Breton coast in France. The moor overlooks the sea, and there no corn grows, and the grass is so coarse that only the village goats can be sustained by it. And on that moor there is an avenue of standing stones, so ancient that where they once led is not known. And who stood them up there in their places has been long forgotten, though there are some who say it was the fairies themselves who stood the stones there on the heath to hide and guard their gold. Now at the edge of the heath there was a farm overlooking the river on the other side. The farmer and his sister were thought of as the rich people in the village, for in truth they had a pig to fatten whenever they wanted, and wooden shoes to wear, and black bread to break. And everyone in the village worked on that farm. There was one young man, Bernays, who was happy to make the coins he made, but even more glad to be in the company of the farmer's sister, Rosanique. As kind as she was lovely, they had given their hearts to each other as children. When he had asked the farmer if he might marry Rosanique, the farmer said, "Not until you come, with pockets gleaming with gold." And so Rosanique and Bernays must be satisfied with the glimpses they had of one another going about their chores each day. On Christmas Eve, however, the entire village gathered round the farmer's table. They had soup sweetened with honey and a fine beer to drink and that good black bread to break among themselves. And Bernays and Rosanique supped not only of the food, but of each other's loving glances. Before the meal was over there was a knock at the door. It was opened, and the cold air of Christmas Eve blew in. And they saw a beggar there, well known among all the villages. He was a sly rogue and thought that he practiced dark arts, for often when he was in a village, the corn turned black on the stalks, or the cows gave up giving milk, or a healthy person would drop dead to the ground. And so all but with the kindest and most innocent hearts feared him. The farmer invited him in, for he did not dare cross the man, let him eat at the table, and when the beggar asked if he might sleep in the stable that night, again the farmer would not say no. There was room in the stable, only one donkey and one ox, who worked hard beside the farmer all year long, and the beggar lay down between them to take of their heat, as he took of anything he could, giving as little as he might back again. And before the beggar drifted off to sleep that night, he heard the clock striking 12, and at that moment the donkey and the ox began to speak to each other in human voices, for it was their gift, because their ancestors stood in another stable 2,000 years before. And the donkey said, it's a cold night. Now this fellow here, he's taking our heat. I wonder if he's sleeping. And the beggar began to make the sound of snoring so that he could listen to all it was that was being said between the animals. The ox spoke next, saying, it'll be colder still on New Year's Eve. And that's the night that once every 100 years the stones of Plouhinec will roll down to the river to drink. and as long as they are gone, their treasures are uncovered. If this foolish, snoring man only knew it, he'd go that night and steal what he could of the fairy hoard. Ah, said the donkey, little good it would do him, for the stones are as jealous of the treasure as the fairies once were. They'll roll back and crush any man who comes unless he brings a bouquet of crowsfoot and a 5-leaved clover in his hand, and only then can he protect himself. Said the ox. It'll do him little good, though, unless he sheds the blood of a man there on the heath. For if he does not, the gold in the morning will crumble to dust. And then the magical moment was done, and the animals fell quiet. But the beggar was already planning. In the morning before dawn, he was up and out of the stable. He thought he'd better not look for the crowsfoot or the clover around the town, lest he gets all of the people in the village suspicious of his intent. He needed to find the plants, and then he needed to find the fool whose blood he could shed that night when the stones came back angry for his taking of their gold. And do you know, in the next week he found the crowsfoot, and in time, the day before New Year's Eve, he found a 5-leaved clover, and these he tucked in his pocket and made his way back to Plouhinec. And when he reached the heath, whom should he see but Bernez? In the last hours of the day, he had taken a chisel and a hammer, and he was carving a cross upon the largest of the stones on the heath. And the beggar said, "Such foolish work, not to me," said Bernez. "So I know that this cross will offer comfort to a traveler someday, and so I leave it here as a sign." And he finished his work. Now the beggar remembered the boy from the meal a week before, remembered the stolen glances between him and the farmer's sister. And that's when the beggar said, "You, Bernez, are you as poor as I think you are?" "Probably poorer," said the boy. "What would you do if you had pockets full of gold?" "Well, I'd go straight away and ask again to have Rosnique for my wife. I know she would accept me. And if I had gold in my pockets, her brother would accept me too." "And what if you had more than pockets full of gold?" "Well, then I'd make sure that everyone who was in need in the village would have what they needed." "Indeed," said the beggar, "you are just the man I am looking for. Tonight, it is the 100-year mark, and the stones of the heath will roll down to the river to drink, and while they are gone, we can gather their treasure. I am an old man. You are young and nimble. You can climb into the holes and pull out more gold than I can hope to get. I will share it with you. All I need is for you to take courage." And of course he neglected to say that he needed to be protected with crowsfoot and clover, and that someone would have to give their life that night for the gold to still be substantial in the morning. Bernez only imagined that the next day he could start a new year with Rosnique as his wife, and so he said, "Yes, I will help you, and I will be indebted to you for the rest of my life." "Indeed," said the beggar. "Perhaps that won't be long." And so they waited there until the clock struck midnight. And then the ground began to shake, and they saw each of the stones uproot itself, and if it were round, to roll, and if it were more flattened out, to flop and bump and flop and bump, and they went down to the river to drink. And the two men saw the moonlight gleaming on the gold inside the holes left behind. Bernez walked over and took some gold and put it in his pockets, and soon his pockets were full, so he went to help the beggar, and now the beggar had brought 2 bags, 2 sacks, and he insisted that the boy climb into the hole and put the gold in the sacks and then hand them up to him, and this Bernez did. But then they heard the ground begin to shake again, and looking up they saw the rocks, the stones tumbling and rolling toward them. "We must run or we are lost," said Bernez. "You are lost anyway," said the beggar, "for they will kill anyone who does not have crowsfoot and clover. Here, I will be safe and you will die, and you must die. For me to be a rich man, your blood must be shed." "But why?" Bernez said. I have never done any harm to you. It is what it is, said the beggar. And he held up the crow's foot, and it was true that when they smelt the crow's foot and the clover, the stones all rolled around the beggar and began to bear down upon Bernez. He ran for a time, but then fell, and he looked up and he saw them coming. He could not bear to look, so he placed his hands over his face, but just at that moment, the biggest of the stones came rolling toward him and stopped in front of him, as if to give him sanctuary. And the other stones had to go around the large one, leaving Bernez in peace and settling into their places. Bernez looked up and he saw that it was the stone on which he had carved the cross, and it lingered there. And then it turned to roll back toward its own resting place. And in rolling, it overtook the beggar, dragging the two heavy sacks. The man saw the rock coming, threw down the sacks, pulled out his crow's foot and clover once more. But the new magic on the stone was not stopped by the old magic in the beggar's hand. And the stone rolled over the man, crushing him into dust, even as Bernez watched in horror. When the last of the stones was settled, the young man walked to the place where the beggar had last been seen, but he was no more. The bags he had been dragging lay there, ready to be picked up and taken back to the village, where the gold inside them would do good for everyone. Bernez went home and slept hard that night, and when he awakened, he found the gold in his pockets still there, gleaming, and the gold in the sacks ready to be given to the poor. He walked to the farmer's house, and he showed him the treasure. And Rosnique was his reward, though she'd have had him anyway. Only he'd been able to ask and get beyond her brother, now glad to have Bernez and family. And so they lived their long lives in peace and generosity, caring for others, even as they cared for themselves. Happy New Year.